The wind swept low across the open prairie, carrying with it the faint smell of dust, smoke, and the dry silence of land that had seen too much struggle. The ranch sat alone, weathered wood leaning against the years, its fences creaking under. The weight of age. To most eyes, it was nothing more than a lonely outpost on the edge of the frontier, a place where one man's endurance fought endlessly against time and the wilderness. But on that morning, the silence broke not with the clash of gunfire or the thunder of hooves charging to attack, but with something no settler, no soldier, no traveler could ever have imagined. 100 warriors appeared on the horizon, riding in silence, their figures cutting against the rising sun. They did not shout, they did not raise their weapons, but the weight of their presence was enough to turn the air heavy with dread. The rancher had lived through storms before. He had faced droughts, wild animals, and nights where the shadows pressed in from every corner, but nothing prepared him for this. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, maybe dust rising from faraway cattle. But as the line of riders grew clearer, his heart sank. 100 warriors, mounted and unyielding, their formation precise and deliberate, moved like a wave closing in. Every hoofbeat seemed to echo across the plains, a sound that carried both power and purpose. The ranch, once his refuge, now felt like a trap with no way out. The frontier was never a place of peace. It was a land balanced between survival and ruin, where every sunrise carried a question: who would last another day? And here, in the heart of that struggle, one man found himself staring down a force so vast it seemed impossible. He had heard stories told around campfires, tales of warriors who rode together with such discipline and silence that they seemed more like spirits than men. Yet seeing them with his own eyes, surrounding his small spread of land, was something no tale had captured fully. He thought about running, about slipping out the back and vanishing into the brush. But there was no chance. Every side was sealed, every escape blocked. The warriors circled slowly, their faces unreadable, their silence louder than any war cry. The rancher's hand shook as he gripped the worn handle of his rifle, though deep. Down he knew a single weapon against so many was little more than false hope. Still, the instinct to fight was there, carved into him by years of hardship. The silence stretched on. Not one word was spoken. Not one gesture gave away their intent. That, more than anything, rattled him. He had expected shouts, maybe demands or warnings. He had expected to hear the sharp cry of challenge. Instead, the stillness pressed on like the weight of the sky. The only sounds were the horses' breaths and the creak of saddles as the riders shifted in their seats. It was a kind of discipline he had never seen before, a unity that spoke of something greater than battle. The ranch itself stood small in the midst of it all. Weather-beaten boards, a chimney leaning slightly to one side, fences broken in places, where the cattle had once pushed through. To any stranger, it would seem an unworthy target. There was no gold here, no treasure, no grand prize to justify 100 riders coming down upon it. Yet here they were, their eyes fixed on the man standing by the porch, his rifle heavy in his hands. He thought of the frontier nights when he had sat by the fire, hearing distant drums echo across the plains. He thought of the whispers that spoke, of a code, a way of life among the warriors that outsiders could never understand. Some said it was honor. Some said it was memory. Some said it was vengeance. But the truth of it was always hidden behind the silence. And now, that silence had found its way to his very door. The air grew thick with tension as the circle tightened. The rancher felt his chest tighten with it, every breath shorter than the last. His eyes darted from one rider to another, searching for a clue. Yet every face remained calm, every set of eyes sharp and unwavering. Not one horse stamped or whinnied. Not one hand strayed from reins or weapons. It was as if they had all agreed, without a single word, on something far greater than attack. He could feel his pulse pounding in his ears. He braced himself for the first move, the first sign that this was the end. But instead, something unexpected happened. The lead rider, tall and steady in the saddle, lifted a hand. The movement was slow, deliberate, and carried a weight that froze the rancher in place. Then, as if bound by one heartbeat, every warrior followed. 100 hands rose into the air in unison, not in threat, but in salute. The rancher's breath caught. His rifle slipped slightly in his grip as confusion swelled inside him. A salute? To him? To this place? He had prepared for a fight, for the storm of violence that seemed certain to fall upon his lonely outpost. But instead, what he faced was silence, respect, and a gesture that carried more power than any bullet could. The warriors held their salute, the rising sun casting long shadows across the dry earth. The stillness deepened, no less tense, but charged with something different, something ancient. The rancher could not move. He could not speak. He could only stand and stare, trying to understand what it meant. Were they honoring him? Warning? Him? Remembering something he could not see? Time stretched thin, each second longer than the last. The horses shifted slightly, leather creaked again, and still the warriors held their silent gesture. The rancher felt the weight of history pressing on him, as though he had been pulled into a story far greater than himself. He thought of all the struggles that had played out on these plains, the battles, the losses, the unspoken pacts. Perhaps this was not about him at all. Perhaps it was about the land itself, the scars it carried, and the lives it had seen dot, and then without a word, without a single sound, the salute ended. Hands lowered. The circle of riders remained, their silence as heavy as before. The rancher's heart pounded harder than ever. He still had no answer, no understanding of what would come next. The salute had stunned him, but it had not resolved. The question burning inside his chest. Why had they come, and what did they want? The riders did not move away. They did not break their circle. They only waited, as if the next moment depended not on them, but on him. The rancher felt the weight of it settling on his shoulders. Alone, with 100 warriors watching, he knew whatever he did now would decide everything. He tightened his grip on the rifle, then loosened it again, torn between fear and a strange, rising respect. The frontier was a place of choices, each one carrying the power to change everything. And here, on this morning, surrounded by silence and the steady gaze of 100 warriors, the rancher realized he stood at the edge of one such choice. What would follow, he could not yet know. All he knew was that nothing on the frontier would ever be the same again. The rancher stood frozen on the porch, his eyes locked on the 100 riders who had surrounded his land. Their silent salute still lingered in his mind, a gesture that carried a weight he could not yet name. He felt the pull of history in the moment, as though the plains themselves had paused to witness what was unfolding. His breath came slow, his thoughts scattered. He had braced for violence, yet here he was, standing in the middle of something far stranger, something that felt like both a warning and a ceremony. The prairie had always been a place of stories. Travelers told them at way stations, merchants shared them at trading posts, and lone wanderers whispered them by the glow of their campfires. Some stories were born of fear, others of pride. The rancher had heard them all. Tales of warriors who vanished into the night without leaving a trail, or who gathered in silence as though answering to an ancient call. But this was no story retold. This was real, unfolding before his very eyes, and he had no explanation for it. He lowered his rifle slowly, careful not to seem reckless, though the silence made every movement feel louder than it was. He thought of how far he had come to build this ranch, How many years of sweat it had taken to make a life out of dust and grass. The house, the corral, the broken fence, every piece of it carried his struggle. And now, with 100 warriors watching, it all felt fragile, like a single gust of wind could scatter it. The lead rider sat tall and motionless, his hands still steady on the reins. The rancher studied him, searching for a sign, some small shift that might explain their purpose, but none came. Behind him, the line of warriors remained in perfect rhythm, their horses calm, their eyes locked on the man alone by the porch. It was as though they had been bound together by something deeper than words, something older than the frontier itself. The rancher's thoughts drifted backward to the day he first arrived on this land. The sky had stretched endless above him, a blue so wide it seemed to swallow him whole. The soil was hard, the winters bitter, the summers unforgiving. Yet he had stayed, planting his roots in the middle of emptiness, building not just a home but a kind of defiance against the odds. He remembered thinking then that the land would either break him or make him stronger. And now, surrounded, he wondered if the land had always held secrets he was never meant to uncover. He remembered voices from the past traders who warned him that the frontier carried more than storms and wolves. They spoke of unseen boundaries, of lines drawn long before settlers came with their wagons and cattle. Some places were not meant to be claimed, they had said. Some places held memory like a scar. The rancher had laughed it off back then, stubborn as the soil itself, but standing now under the weight of 100 watchful eyes. He felt those old warnings stir inside him. The silence deepened and his mind searched for reasons. Why here? Why him? He was no general, no outlaw, no man of power. He was only a rancher, living with his cattle and his solitude. Yet here were 100 warriors, riding not with rage but with solemnity, as though they had come for something he did not yet understand. Their salute had struck him like a hammer, unexpected, heavy, impossible to ignore. It was not a threat, not a demand, but it was not kindness either. It was something beyond his measure. He looked again at the circle, trying to read meaning. In their stillness, the horses' ears twitched with the wind, tails swished against flies, but no one spoke, no one moved. The rancher's chest tightened with the thought that maybe this was not about him at all. Maybe it was about the ground beneath him, the land he had fenced, the water he had drawn from the well, the soil he had broken with his plow. Perhaps their presence was not meant to salute the man, but the memory of something his ranch now stood upon. A crow called from somewhere beyond the ridge, its cry sharp against the silence. The rancher flinched at the sound, though the warriors did not stir. He wondered if they heard the same thing he did, the voice of the land itself, reminding him that he was a guest here, no matter how long he had stayed. His grip tightened on the rifle again, not to fight, but to anchor himself against the swell of thoughts. The frontier had always been a place of uncertain truths. Every man who came here carved out his own version of it, his own piece of survival. But beneath it all, there were layers older than any ranch, older than any wagon trail. He could feel it now, pressing against him, rising up through the silence of the riders. He realized that the salute might not have been for him, but for what had been lost, for what had been remembered, for what had once stood before his boards. And fences ever touched the ground, and yet they did not leave. The salute had ended, but the circle remained. The riders waited, their presence heavy, their silence unbroken. The rancher's heart pounded with each passing moment. He wondered if they expected something from him, a word, a gesture, a choice. The thought made his throat dry, his mind race. He was only a man, small against the weight of 100, small against the history pressing through the silence. What could they possibly want from him? The sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the grass. The light glinted off the edges of the saddles, the worn leather reins, the calm eyes of the horses. Still, The circle held. The rancher shifted. His stance, the wooden porch creaking under his boots. The sound was swallowed instantly, lost in the waiting silence. He wanted to speak, to call out, but the words caught in his chest. Anything he said might shatter the moment, and he was not sure if that would bring peace or ruin. Every second stretched like an eternity. His mind kept circling the same unanswered question: why had they come? The salute had felt like honor, but the silence afterward felt like judgment. He could not tell which mattered more. All he knew was that he was trapped in a moment larger than himself, a moment that carried the weight of both past and future. The rancher glanced back at the doorway of his home, the worn wood familiar, comforting in its simplicity. He had built it board by board, hammer by hammer, never imagining it would one day stand at the center of such a gathering. He thought of leaving the porch, stepping out to meet the riders face to face. But fear kept him still. Not fear of violence, but fear of what he might learn if he did. The silence endured, thicker than the air, heavier than the ground beneath him. He could feel that something was coming, though he did not yet know if it would fall upon him like a storm or pass by like a shadow. His hand loosened on the rifle, then tightened again, a rhythm as steady as the horse's breathing. And so the standstill continued, one man on a lonely ranch, surrounded by 100 silent warriors whose salute had opened a mystery larger than the frontier itself. The rancher's heart beat faster with each passing second, and though no words had been spoken, he knew the silence was far from empty. It carried meaning he had yet to understand, and until it revealed itself, he would stand caught in the balance, unsure whether the next moment would bring salvation or loss. The circle of riders did not break. The rancher felt the sun crawling higher over the plains, baking the dust, stretching shadows long, and still the warriors held their ground. The longer it went on, the heavier the silence grew, like a storm pressing down before the lightning. He shifted his weight again, his boots scraping on the wooden boards, but the sound felt too loud, almost like a challenge. His hands trembled at his sides. He was used to facing the wilderness, to fighting with nature for survival, but this was something different. This was a force that seemed tied to memory, to something older than his ranch, older even than the fences that now cut across the prairie. The riders had not come to destroy, not yet, but they had not come to leave either. And that was the torment. The rancher's thoughts swung like a gate in the wind. Was he being judged? Warned? Tested? He wanted to know if there was a way to break through the silence, but his tongue stayed still. Speaking too soon might bring the end, and he could not shake the feeling that his next move would decide everything. From the corner of his eye, he noticed movement. One rider at the far side of the circle leaned slightly forward, scanning the ranch more closely. His gaze lingered on the corral, then the well, then the small barn slouched under years of weather. The rancher's stomach tightened. He remembered digging that well through stone and clay, working until his hands bled just to find water. To him, it was survival. But to them, what was it? Was the well a scar on the land? A wound they could not ignore? The rancher's mind drifted further back. He recalled the old trader at the river crossing who once told him, "This land remembers. Every cut, every claim, it holds." At the time, the rancher had laughed. Now, surrounded by the circle, he felt the words come alive. His home, his sweat, his years of labor, perhaps it was built on ground that carried stories he had never been told. The salute had not been for him alone. It had been for something tied to the soil itself. Another rider's horse shifted, stamping once, then still again. The sound echoed in the rancher's chest. He wondered if the horses knew something their riders did not say. He studied the animals. Closely, none of them were restless, none showed fear. They stood calm, steady, as though the circle itself was a ritual older than any man watching. That calmness unnerved him more than anger ever could. Behind him, the ranch creaked in the heat. He thought about the nights he had spent awake inside those walls, listening to coyotes howl in the distance or storms pound against the roof. Ranch had always felt lonely, cut off from the world. But now it was the center of something larger, something that had drawn 100 riders to stand in its shadow. The thought made his chest feel tight, his heart unsteady. He wondered what the frontier would say if it had a voice. It was a place of survival, yes, but also a place of memory. Every tree cut, every trail carved, every well dig each act was recorded in silence. And maybe that silence had finally come to speak through the riders. Still, the rancher could not understand why it was him. There were other settlers, other ranches scattered across the plains. Why had the warriors chosen his? Was it chance, or was there something buried beneath the boards of his house? Something hidden in the soil he worked every day? He thought of the bones he had found once while plowing, old and brittle, cracked by the sun. He had tossed them aside, never thinking twice. Now the memory came back sharp, cutting deeper with each passing second. The lead rider finally shifted, his horse stepping forward by a single pace. The circle held, but the movement struck like thunder. The rancher's breath caught in his chest. He gripped his rifle tighter, though not to raise it, only to steady himself. The leader's eyes met his, dark and unreadable, and for a long moment, the world seemed to narrow down to just the two of them. The rancher wanted to ask, to demand, to plead anything that would break the silence. But the words wouldn't come. He thought about how fragile everything around him really was. The corral, the barn, the fences, all of it could vanish in a single day if the circle chose it. And yet, they hadn't moved to destroy. Their presence felt like a question, one he hadn't yet answered. The conflict inside him burned hotter than the sun above. Part of him wanted to step down from the porch, to face the riders as a man should, open and unafraid. Another part of him screamed to stay still, to keep distance, to let them make the first move. His heart pounded with the weight of both choices in the distance. The land stretched endless, the horizon blurring in the heat. He thought of how small he was in all of it, just one man on one ranch, yet caught in a moment that felt like it could shift the course of everything. He imagined the whispers that might one day travel across the frontier about this day, the ranch, the salute, the silence that held 100 warriors still. The air seemed to thicken, heavy with meaning. The riders did not relax, did not leave, did not threaten. They only waited, their presence filling the space between him and the land he had claimed. The rancher realized the true conflict was no longer just about survival. It was about belonging, about whether his claim to this place was a mark of strength or a wound carved into soil that was never his to begin with. And as the thought pressed deeper, another question rose with it: if the salute was not for him, then who or what was it for? The rancher felt the weight of the question pressing down like a stone he could not lift. He stared at the circle, at the silent figures who seemed to hold answers he was not yet allowed to hear. The sun beat down, the silence stretched, and the conflict grew sharper with every breath. The rancher knew that whatever truth lay behind the salute, it had not yet been revealed. He also knew that the waiting itself was part of it. The riders would not break first. That choice, that burden, would fall to him. And so he stood, caught between fear and defiance, between survival and understanding. While the circle of warriors held steady, their silence deeper than any words, the tension did not ease. If anything, it grew, twisting around him, binding him tighter with every passing second. He knew the conflict was only beginning. The frontier was speaking through silence, and he had yet to learn whether he was meant to answer or to fall. The air grew hotter as the day climbed toward noon, yet the circle of riders held as steady as stone. Their stillness was not lifeless, it was charged, as if every breath of wind carried the weight of something unsaid. The rancher could feel it pressing against his skin, a pressure that made the silence almost unbearable. Sweat traced down his back, but he dared not move too quickly. Every step, every glance seemed heavy with meaning, and he knew one wrong motion could break whatever fragile balance kept the riders from turning violent. He shifted his eyes across the line, counting again, though he already knew the number. 100, always 100. The symmetry of it unsettled him. It wasn't a random gathering, it was deliberate, chosen. He thought of the salute they had given, that strange, unified gesture that felt like both honor and warning. His mind circled around it endlessly. Who was it for? Him? The land? A memory carried in silence? The question gnawed at him, and each passing moment without an answer sharpened the tension. The leader sat unmoving, his gaze fixed on the rancher, as though waiting for a decision. Behind him, the line of warriors remained poised, horses steady, eyes like flint. The rancher's heart thudded against his ribs. He had faced storms that tore roofs from houses, floods that drowned the earth, and winters that froze cattle where they stood. None of it compared to this. This was not just a fight for land or survival. This was something deeper, something tied to the very bones of the frontier. He thought of the bones he had once uncovered while plowing,
brittle and yellow beneath the soil.
He had thrown them aside, not realizing what ground he was breaking. That memory came back to him now with a sting, and he wondered if the warriors knew if their silence was not about him, but about what lay buried under his home. Perhaps the salute had been for the ones forgotten, the ones whose presence lingered unseen beneath his boots. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint creak of the barn. The sound made him flinch, and for the first time he saw movement ripple through the circle. Not much, just a shift of shoulders, a tightening of reins, but enough to make his pulse race. The riders had not come for talk, not yet. They had come for something greater, and the moment to reveal it was drawing closer. Rancher's eyes darted to the horizon, but there was no escape. Every path was blocked by the ring of horses, every road closed by silence. He was trapped, not by walls but by expectation. He realized then that the true conflict was no longer about the ranch or even survival. It was about choice. The riders would not speak. They were waiting for him to act, to prove something, though he could not yet name what it was. He thought again of stepping down from the porch, of walking out into the circle with empty hands. The idea filled him with dread. To leave the porch was to step into their world, into whatever ritual or memory they were carrying. But staying felt no safer. The longer he stood still, the more it seemed the silence itself might crush him. The leader's horse stamped once, the sound sharp in the heat. The rancher's breath caught. The circle seemed to close tighter, though no rider moved forward. It was as if the land itself had drawn in, holding its breath for what would come next. The rancher gripped his rifle harder, though his arm shook with the weight of it. He had no illusions left. This weapon could not save him if the riders chose to attack. It was nothing more than a prop to keep his courage steady. The sun glared down, and shadows shortened across the dirt. Each second dragged slower, heavier. The rancher felt himself caught in a current he could not escape, pulled toward a moment he could not yet see. His throat burned with the urge to call out, to demand an answer, to break the silence, but still, he held back. He knew that whatever words left his mouth would matter more than anything he had ever said. Then came another shift. A single rider on the far side of the circle dismounted, landing soft in the dust. The sound of boots against earth was quiet, but it cut through the silence like a drum. The rancher's chest tightened, his pulse hammering. The rider did not move closer, only stood, hand resting on the horse's neck, gaze fixed on the ranch. It was not an attack, not yet, but it was the first crack in the stillness. The rancher's mind spun. Was this a signal? A test? He looked to the leader, but the man did not move, his expression unreadable. The dismounted rider stood like a marker, a sign that something was about to shift. The circle remained intact, but the air felt different now, charged, waiting for the next. Spark. The rancher swallowed hard. His hands trembled as he lowered the rifle slightly, though not fully. His body screamed with indecision, torn between surrender and defiance. He knew the climax was near, the breaking point of silence, the moment where everything hidden would come to light. Yet he still had no clue whether it would fall in his favor or crush him completely. The horses snorted softly, hooves shifting in the dust as though they too sensed the rising storm. The ranch seemed to shrink around him, every board, every nail, every piece of his life pressed under the weight of 100 eyes. He had built this place as a refuge, but now it felt like the center of a trial he had never agreed to face, and still no word was spoken. The riders held their silence, their unity unbroken, their purpose unreadable. The rancher's breath came shallow, his chest tight with fear and anticipation. He felt that the next moment, whatever it was, would decide not just his fate, but the meaning of everything that had led him here. The circle waited. The leader's eyes bore into him. The dismounted rider stood like a shadow cast forward. And the rancher, alone on the porch with the weight of the frontier pressing down, realized he was standing at the edge of the moment that would change everything. The circle of riders held its breath, the air so thick with expectation it seemed. The prairie itself had gone silent. The rancher's body felt heavy, his hands trembling on the rifle, though he knew the weapon had no meaning anymore. This was no battle of bullets and blood. This was something larger, something that had pulled him into its current whether he wanted it or not. He stood on the porch of the ranch he had built with his own sweat and years, staring at the 100 riders who had come with no words, only silence and the weight of history pressing in all around them. The dismounted rider on the far side. The circle took a step forward. Dust rose around his boots, drifting slowly on the wind. The rancher's chest tightened, his throat dry. The leader of the warriors gave no sign, yet the movement carried purpose, as though it was part of a ritual being played out before his eyes. The man walked only a few paces, then stopped, and in that stillness the rancher felt as though he was standing at the edge of some truth he had been blind to his whole life. His eyes drifted to the ground beneath his boots, to the soil he had tilled, the bones he had once tossed aside without thought. The memories seared into him now with new meaning. Perhaps that was why they had come. Perhaps the salute, the silence, the circle, it was not about him at all. It was about the ground itself, about what it remembered, about the lives that had been lived here long before he had claimed it as his own. The leader finally moved. He lifted his hand slowly, the same hand that had given the first signal for the salute. The rancher braced himself, his breath caught in his chest. The riders all followed, each one raising a hand once more, their silence deep and solemn. The gesture was not anger. It was recognition. It was remembrance. The rancher's heart pounded. He felt a rush of shame, of respect, of awe. He lowered his rifle to his side, the barrel pointing harmlessly at the ground. Then, with a slow and uncertain motion, he lifted his own hand. It was clumsy, awkward, not nearly as steady as theirs, but it was the only answer he had to give. Air shifted with that moment, like a thread being tied across a great divide. The riders held their salute, then slowly lowered their hands together, the unity of their motion sharper than any spoken word. The leader gave the smallest nod, and the meaning sank deep into the rancher's chest. It was not forgiveness, not threat. It was acknowledgement. The land had been honored, the memory remembered, and his part in it was now written into the silence. The dismounted rider turned back to his horse and climbed into the saddle with ease. The circle remained unbroken, but the tension had changed. The rancher could feel it in the way the air lightened, in the way his chest loosened. Whatever judgment had hung heavy over him was easing now, though not erased. The frontier was not a place that forgot. It only carried its truths forward, without. A word, the leader shifted his reins, and the circle began to move. Slowly, the 100 riders turned their horses outward, breaking their formation with the same precision they had held it. Dust rose around them as the circle widened, then stretched into a line that pointed toward the horizon. The sound of hooves filled the air, steady and rhythmic, until the silence was broken at last by the low thunder of departure. The rancher stood motionless on his porch, watching as the riders disappeared into the distance. The dust lingered long after they were gone, swirling in the heat, as though the land itself carried the echo of their presence. His rifle felt heavy in his hand, but he lowered it onto the porch rail, no longer needing it. His breath came slow, his mind spinning with everything he had just witnessed. He realized then that the salute had not been for him alone. It had been for the ground he stood on, for the lives buried in it, for the memory of a world older than his ranch. His part in it was small, but in that silence he had been pulled into the weight of it, forced to see what he had ignored. The frontier was not just soil to be worked, wood to be cut, or cattle to be driven. It was history, memory, and belonging, tied together by people who had lived and died long before he arrived. He looked at his ranch with new eyes. The boards of the house, the leaning barn, the broken fences, all of it seemed smaller now, almost fragile against the backdrop of what he had just seen. Yet he felt something stronger too. He felt that he was no longer alone. The silence of the riders had filled the land, and though they had gone, the meaning of their presence remained. That night, as the sun sank and shadows stretched across the prairie, the rancher sat by his fire. The crackle of wood seemed louder in the stillness, but it no longer felt lonely. He thought of the salute, of the 100 hands raised in perfect unity. He thought of the land under his feet, of the stories it carried, of the weight of remembering. For the first time in his years on the frontier, he felt part of something larger than his own struggle to survive. The silence had not been a threat. It had been a lesson. The warriors had not come to take from him, nor to fight him. They had come to remind him that the land was not his alone, that every ridge, every stream, every patch of soil held stories that demanded respect. Their salute had been both warning and gift, and he knew now that his life on the ranch would never be the same. Days later, when he walked the fields again, he saw the soil differently. He paused at the well, at the corral, at the places where his work had scarred the ground. He touched the earth with his hand, and for the first time, he whispered thanks. The silence of the riders had left its mark on him, and he knew it was his responsibility now to carry it forward. The frontier was never an easy place. It tested every man, every woman who dared to carve a life out of it. But as the rancher stood alone, he no longer felt cut off. He felt bound to the land, to its history, to the memory that the 100 riders had carried with them. And in that binding, he found strength. The story of that day spread, carried by travelers and whispers across the plains. Some said 100 warriors had come to destroy, but chose not to. Others said they had come to honor what was lost. The truth, as always on the frontier, lived in silence. But the rancher knew. He had seen it, felt it, and been changed by it. When the wind swept low across the prairie again, carrying dust and silence, he stood on his porch and listened. The land still spoke, though not with words. And now, at last, he knew how to hear. It The salute of the 100 warriors had left him with more than fear or awe, it had left him with understanding. The ranch remained, weathered but standing, a small mark against the endless horizon. Yet it no longer felt lonely. It felt alive, connected to something beyond fences and cattle. The frontier had given him a gift that day, delivered in silence, and he carried it in his heart until his last breath. And so the tale ended not with violence, but with remembrance. 100 warriors had surrounded a lonely ranch, not to destroy, but to teach. Their silent salute stunned the frontier, but its meaning lingered far longer. It was a story of land, memory, and respect, one that echoed in silence, carried forever by the wind. Would you like me to also shape this ending into a short, reflective closing paragraph? The kind of message that would resonate with your YouTube audience and leave them with a sense of takeaway, almost like a narrator's final thought?